I didn't set out to reconstruct a civilization that supposedly never existed, but when you spend enough time examining the architectural remains, the industrial artifacts, and the photographic evidence from the mid-1800s through the early 1900s, you begin to notice something unsettling. Not just what's there, but what's missing. The absence of explanation, the gaps in the historical record. I realized something profoundly unsettling. The story we've been told about daily life in the 1800s doesn't match the physical evidence. Not the buildings that remain, not the infrastructure still visible beneath our streets, not the photographs that show a world far more sophisticated than we've been led to believe. So I started asking a different question. Not did Tartaria exist, but rather what would daily life have looked like in a civilization that left behind these structures? This is an investigation into what life might have actually looked like during the period we're told was primitive, pre-industrial, and backwards. A period when, according to official history, most people lived in squalor, traveled by horse, communicated by letter, and built with simple tools. But when you examine what actually remains, the roads too perfectly graded, the canals too precisely engineered, the buildings too mathematically exact, a different picture emerges. Not of primitive struggle, but of coordinated movement. Not of isolation, but of connection. Not of simplicity, but of systems we've somehow forgotten how to recognize. What was daily life like in this forgotten world? What did people actually do? How did they move, work, trade, and live within structures that seemed designed for purposes we no longer understand? The official narrative collapses the moment you ask these questions. Imagine waking in a Tartarian city at dawn, not in some romanticized past, but in the actual physical spaces that remain. You find yourself in apartment buildings with impossible ceiling heights, 12, 14, even 16 feet, far beyond any practical heating consideration for a primitive society. The windows are so tall they seem designed for giants, or perhaps for something else entirely: light distribution, air circulation, or atmospheric pressure regulation. You rise in a room with crown molding so intricate it would take modern craftsmen months to replicate, plasterwork that flows like frozen water, geometric patterns that repeat with mathematical precision across thousands of buildings in dozens of cities on multiple continents, all supposedly built by individual contractors working independently, yet all arriving at identical solutions. Ask yourself, how does that happen? The morning light enters through windows positioned not randomly, but deliberately aligned with solar angles calculated for seasonal variation. The entire structure seems oriented toward natural forces, wind, sun, water flow, in ways our modern buildings completely ignore. You dress in clothing we see in photographs, formal, layered, and deliberately constructed. Not primitive homespun, but manufactured textiles showing industrial-scale production. Cotton from India, silk from Asia, wool from Australia, all available in provincial cities thousands of miles from production centers. Everything arrives with suspicious regularity, as if moved through distribution networks far more sophisticated than horse-drawn wagons could ever support. The question becomes impossible to avoid. What infrastructure made this possible? If you're finding this investigation compelling, consider subscribing or becoming a YouTube member. This kind of research takes hundreds of hours in archives most historians never examine. Your support makes it possible to continue asking the questions conventional history refuses to address. As you step outside, you enter streets that pose their own mysteries. These aren't dirt paths or randomly placed cobblestones, but precisely graded thoroughfares with drainage systems so sophisticated they still function today, over a century later. You see storm drains that connect to underground networks extending for miles, sewage systems that rival modern engineering, and water distribution channels that supplied entire cities with pressurized flow. All of this was supposedly built in the span of a few decades all across the world, all following identical principles. The streets themselves reveal the pattern. They are too wide for simple cart traffic and too perfectly aligned with cardinal directions to be accidental. In city after city, you find the same layout, grand boulevards radiating from central points, creating geometric patterns visible only from above. Star formations, radial designs, and mathematical precision suggest central planning on a scale we're told didn't exist. And the movement along these streets is where the official story becomes impossible to sustain. Photographs from the 1860s and 1870s show streets filled with traffic, not chaotic medieval congestion, but organized flow. You see streetcars running on rails with electrical or cable systems requiring massive infrastructure investment. Omnibuses run on fixed routes, implying coordinated scheduling. Carriages move through a system, not wandering randomly. The deeper I looked, the more I found evidence of transportation networks we've been taught emerged only much later. Street railways existed in hundreds of cities by the 1880s. Cable car systems required massive underground machinery, and elevated trains appeared in major centers with suspicious simultaneity. All of this required engineering expertise that was supposedly unavailable. Who coordinated this? Who planned it? Who possessed the surveying capability, the mathematical knowledge, and the organizational capacity to implement identical systems across continents? The silence in the historical record is deafening. But the streets had only one system. The canals reveal something even more perplexing. I spent months examining canal records across Europe, Asia, and North America. Not just the famous ones like the Erie Canal or the Suez, but the thousands of smaller waterways connecting cities, towns, and industrial centers. The network was vast, coordinated, and precisely engineered, with lock systems, water level management, and seasonal flow regulation. Consider the Grand Canal in China, over 1,000 miles long, connecting major river systems and moving goods and people with an efficiency that wouldn't be matched until the rise of rail. Or look at the canal networks of the Netherlands, Belgium, and northern France. Hundreds of miles of interconnected waterways with standardized dimensions suggesting unified global planning. The British canal system at its peak featured 4,000 miles of navigable waterways, all built in roughly 60 years. They were all compatible and all precisely graded. This wasn't primitive infrastructure, this was systems engineering. Barges moved along these canals with cargoes we can track through port records, grain from the interior, manufactured goods from cities, and raw materials to factories. The volume was staggering. Single barges carried loads that would have required dozens of wagons. These networks moved thousands of tons daily, all coordinated through a system of schedules, toll points, and transfer stations that implied a sophisticated central administration. And here's the strangest part. The engineering required to maintain these networks was extraordinary. We see water level management across hundreds of miles, lock systems synchronized to allow passage, pumping stations to move water uphill, and reservoir systems to manage seasonal variation. Where did this expertise come from? How did it spread so rapidly? Why does the historical record show no learning curve and no period of experimentation, but rather fully formed systems appearing almost simultaneously? The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Beyond the canals, another system operated, the continental connection of the caravans. We're told these were primitive merchant trails, but they were in fact sophisticated corridors of movement. The Silk Road wasn't just a single path, it was a network of routes with established stations, water sources, and rest points positioned at precise intervals. These weren't random stops, they were planned infrastructure. Russian archives contain references to caravans crossing Central Asia with hundreds of camels moving goods worth fortunes, operating on schedules that required coordination across thousands of miles. These weren't wandering merchants, these were organized enterprises moving through established systems. The stations along these routes, the caravanserais of Persia, Central Asia, and Turkey, pose their own questions. These were massive structures with courtyards capable of housing hundreds of travelers and animals. They featured water systems, storage facilities, and defensive walls, all built to identical specifications as if following architectural standards distributed across empires. Inside these structures, you find evidence of the trade itself. Goods from China appearing in European markets, European manufacturers reaching Asian cities, and African products distributed across continents. The coordination problem becomes overwhelming. How do you synchronize movement across continents without modern communication? How do you establish trade standards, currency exchange, and contract enforcement across linguistic boundaries? The official explanation that this emerged organically collapses under examination. And then there are the airships. This is where conventional historians stop listening and where the documented evidence becomes too uncomfortable to acknowledge. But the records exist. Patent applications for dirigibles and lighter-than-air craft throughout the mid-1800s, newspaper accounts of aerial exhibitions, and engineering journals discussing propulsion systems and navigation techniques are all there. We see photographs showing structures that could only be airship mooring stations, tall masts atop buildings, anchoring points, and elevated platforms. While I'm not claiming massive fleets or routine aerial commerce for everyone, the evidence suggests a development of transportation that has been systematically erased from the mainstream narrative. Consider the implications. If even limited airship travel existed, it changes everything about information distribution, reconnaissance, and rapid elite movement. It suggests a level of technological sophistication incompatible with the primitive narrative we've inherited. The buildings themselves hint at this, with rooftop structures that have no apparent purpose and elevated platforms on government buildings. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Accounts from World's Fairs, like the 1893 Chicago Columbian Exposition, describe aerial demonstrations and tethered balloons. Then, after 1900, these references largely disappear, not because the technology failed, but because something changed in how we documented technological development. What happened? Why does the historical record show such a dramatic discontinuity? Daily life happened inside these structures, and that's where the mystery deepens. The buildings themselves reveal functions we've been taught to ignore. They weren't just homes or factories. They were spaces designed for specific purposes we no longer recognize. Basements extend far deeper than necessary for storage, featuring multi-level underground chambers with brick archways and mysterious equipment mounts. Official history calls them cellars, but the engineering, sealed chambers, and pressure-resistant walls is too deliberate. The main floors show evidence of built-in systems we've removed and forgotten. Wall cavities too large for simple plumbing, and ventilation systems far more sophisticated than required for simple air circulation. Throughout the ornamentation, we find mathematical patterns and geometric progressions that repeat across continents. Official history dismisses this as style, but the precision suggests a meaning we have lost. The rhythm of daily work reveals the most troubling anomalies. Factories in photographs aren't primitive workshops. They are massive structures with assembly systems requiring global coordination. Textile mills in the 1830s and steel foundries in the 1850s operated at industrial scales with no gradual transition period. Inside, we find equipment that shouldn't exist, precision metalworking machinery and hydraulic systems operating at high pressures. Where did the training come from? The physical evidence suggests inherited systems and technology that was deployed rather than developed. Daily commerce reveals the deepest mystery. Markets operated with price coordination across continents and currency exchange systems. This was integrated commerce, requiring information technology we're told came much later. The economics don't work unless something fundamental is missing. How did infrastructure requiring massive capital investment serve entire populations? This brings us to the rhythm of forgetting. It's as if an entire knowledge base was systematically replaced. By 1920, sophisticated discussions of hydraulic systems had disappeared from engineering journals. Imagine watching comprehensive infrastructure be dismantled and replaced by inferior alternatives. The records from the early 1900s contain hints of this nostalgia for a time when systems worked seamlessly. Today, you can still see the evidence. Walk through older cities and the anomalies become overwhelming. Building after building shows capabilities that don't match the official timeline. This isn't nostalgia, it is physical evidence that the narrative of progress is incomplete. Something existed, something sophisticated that we've been taught never was. I discovered a mystery that deepens with every archive visited. People lived in spaces designed for purposes we no longer recognize. Then, something changed. The knowledge was dismantled, and we invented new stories to explain it. But the buildings remember. The streets, the canals, and the underground networks all remember a different story. The question isn't whether this world existed, the evidence is impossible to dismiss. The question is why we've been so determined not to see it. What are we protecting? The buildings stand waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. This investigation continues. If you want to support this research, consider becoming a member or subscribing, because the deeper we look, the more we find that history isn't what we've been told, and that truth, perhaps, is what we've been forgetting all along.